Havana's harbor sits quiet at dawn. Cranes freeze above rusting hulls, their long arms silhouetted against a pale sky. Warehouses glow faintly from within, half lit and waiting. The sea is calm, but nothing moves with urgency. Ships are present, crews are ready, contracts exist somewhere on paper. Yet the stillness tells another story. This port is not blocked by war. It is paused by something harder to see. The common belief is familiar and convenient. Cuba was strangled by ideology, isolation, or mismanagement alone. A small island choosing the wrong system and paying the price. That explanation feels complete because it is visible. It points to speeches, slogans, and policy choices. But it stops short of the mechanism that mattered most. The contrarian truth is narrower and colder. Cuba was targeted through money flows, not just trade bans. Think about that. The island could produce goods, negotiate contracts, even find buyers, and still be unable to get paid in the modern world. Trade does not move on ships alone. It moves on settlement. Goods cross oceans, but money crosses systems. In a world where trade runs on dollars, access to payment systems is power. Cut that access, and sovereignty becomes symbolic. You can load a ship, but you cannot close the deal. You can sign a contract, but you cannot settle it. Production without payment is endurance, not recovery. This is why the stakes were total. Cuba depended on imports for food, fuel, medicine, and machinery. Every container unloaded required a transaction upstream. Every export relied on the promise that payment would arrive. When that promise became uncertain, the entire economy entered a state of risk. Not visible risk, systemic risk. The kind that spreads quietly through planning offices and supply chains. This story matters because it reveals how modern pressure works without invasion. No fleet surrounded Havana. No borders moved. Instead, control passed through clearing houses, correspondent banks, and compliance rules written far from Cuban streets. The pressure looked legal, technical, distant. To those inside the system, it decided whether food arrived, fuel moved, or contracts meant anything at all. Ask how you choke an economy without stopping ships or closing factories. The answer lies in settlement. If money cannot move, everything else slows. Trade becomes fragile. Planning becomes guesswork. The state can organize logistics, but it cannot guarantee outcomes. In that environment, sovereignty exists on paper, while dependency deepens in practice. From the outside, the blockade appeared static, even outdated. A list of restrictions. A political stance frozen in time. But beneath that surface, the financial dimension evolved constantly. Rules tightened. Interpretations expanded. Enforcement moved from headlines to compliance departments. The real battlefield was no longer public. It was procedural. No bombs fell on Havana to announce this shift. No dramatic event marked the transition. It happened transaction by transaction. A bank delayed a transfer. Another refused it. A third closed an account quietly. Each decision made sense in isolation. Together, they formed a cage. Imagine negotiating a sale, shipping goods, and then waiting weeks or months to see if payment arrives. Imagine signing a purchase agreement and discovering the transfer cannot be completed. These are not theoretical problems. They reshape behavior. They increase costs. They punish reliability. Over time, they redefine what is possible. Cuba's position in this system was uniquely exposed. The global financial network is not neutral. It has centers, currencies, and choke points. The dollar sits at its core. Most international trade, even between third parties, passes through U.S.-linked channels at some point. Access to those channels determines who can trade normally and who must improvise. This is why control over payment systems is more powerful than control over ports. Ports handle goods. Banks handle trust. When banks step back, Commerce does not stop instantly. It becomes dangerous. Risk replaces routine. Fear replaces efficiency. The system does the rest on its own. The outside world. These mechanisms looked abstract. Compliance rules. Risk assessments. Regulatory caution. To Cuba, they were concrete. A shipment delayed. A supplier lost. A plant abandoned. The effect was cumulative, not spectacular. That made it harder to explain and easier to dismiss. This was not the story of a single sanction. It was the story of a financial cage built one rule at a time. Each rule was defensible. Each adjustment was technical. No single decision appeared decisive. Together, they changed the operating environment completely. Havana's harbor reflects that reality. Before the squeeze tightened, Cuba did not look powerless. Its ports still connected the Caribbean to wider routes. Sugar left in bulk. Nickel moved toward distant smelters. Tobacco traveled with its own reputation, small in volume but heavy in value. Tourism added another stream, carrying foreign currency through hotels, restaurants, and state agencies. From the outside, these flows suggested continuity rather than crisis. State institutions organized this activity with discipline. Trade ministries negotiated contracts. Shipping schedules were planned months ahead. Warehouses tracked inventory with precision born from necessity. The economy was centralized, but it functioned. Decisions moved through channels that were clear, if not flexible. For partners abroad, Cuba appeared predictable. Goods were delivered. Agreements were honored. On paper, the island remained plugged into global commerce. Imagine the atmosphere inside ministries as export plans were drafted and deals signed with buyers thousands of miles away. There was calculation, not optimism, but also confidence. As long as demand existed, trade could continue. Restrictions were known. Workarounds had been built before. Routes shifted. Partners changed. Adaptation was not new. It had become habit. This resilience shaped identity. Cuba learned to operate under pressure and wear it as proof of endurance. Each adjustment reinforced the belief that the system could absorb whatever came next. When one door closed, another was tested. When one partner withdrew, another was courted. The machinery kept moving because it had learned to move differently. From the outside, that persistence looked like strength. Ships still docked. Goods still moved. Contracts were still announced. Production targets were met often enough to sustain planning. Even under constraint, activity continued. That visibility mattered. It suggested that the economy, though restricted, remained viable. Foreign partners existed, even if fewer and more cautious. Negotiations took longer. Terms grew more complex. But agreements were reached. Trade fairs were attended. Delegations exchanged visits. The image presented was one of continuity under strain, not collapse. For many observers, that distinction was decisive. That as long as dollars moved through the global system, there was space to maneuver. Payments could be routed. Accounts could be managed. Settlement might be slower, but it was still possible. This reality shaped institutional focus. Attention stayed on logistics, supply chains, and output. If goods moved, money would follow. That assumption guided planning. Factories continued operating because inputs arrived often enough. Fuel shipments were arranged. Raw materials were allocated carefully. The state concentrated on keeping production alive, even if margins were thin. Every shipment completed reinforced the belief that effort could overcome restriction. This belief held for a time because it was partly true. The system did not break immediately. Trade adapted. Routes bent. Partnerships shifted. The visible economy remained active. That activity created reassurance inside institutions. If ships sailed and goods left port, the system must still work. What remained largely unexamined was settlement. Contracts depend not just on signatures, but on payment. Trade depends not just on goods, but on clearing. As long as transactions settled, delays could be absorbed. The focus on physical movement obscured the vulnerability of financial movement. Cuba's institutions were built to manage scarcity and logistics. They were less equipped to influence banking risk calculations made elsewhere. The global financial system operates on incentives that are invisible to producers. Compliance departments do not negotiate like trade officials. They avoid risk. When risk rises, they withdraw quietly. For a while, this gap did not dominate outcomes. Payments cleared often enough to sustain operations. The assumption persisted that access would follow effort. If goods were valuable and demand existed, settlement would occur. That logic seemed reasonable because it had worked before. Surface durability reinforced that confidence. The economy did not seize up. The ports did not empty. Tourism adapted. Trade partners adjusted. To many inside the system, these signs meant resilience had won again. The pressure was real, but manageable. Yet surface activity can hide deeper vulnerability. Production without guaranteed settlement is exposed. Contracts without reliable payment are fragile. As long as the global system tolerated risk, Cuba could function within it. That tolerance was the true buffer. Even if few recognized it as such. This is the danger of visible strength. It delays scrutiny of hidden dependence. The more the system appeared to endure, the more it relied on assumptions about access that lay outside national control. Logistics were mastered. Output was maintained. But leverage lived elsewhere. That Cuba's planners focused on what they could see and influence. Cargo volumes, supply schedules, production targets. These were tangible and measurable. Banking decisions made in distant offices were not. That distance created false security. As long as no explicit denial occurred, access felt implicit. The illusion of strength rested on continuity. Trade continued. Institutions functioned. The economy did not collapse under restriction. That endurance was real, but it was conditional. It depended on channels that could close without warning, governed by rules beyond Cuban reach. Before the squeeze tightened, this condition was not fully apparent. The system looked durable because it was still moving. Production continued and agreements were made. Ships sailed and goods changed hands. Everything necessary for trade seemed present. Everything, that is, except control over settlement. That vulnerability sat quietly beneath the surface, unnoticed because nothing had yet forced it into view. The economy appeared to endure, and that appearance shaped belief. It kept factories running and ships sailing. It sustained confidence. The braking mechanism revealed itself not through announcement, but through hesitation. Payments that once cleared routinely began to stall. Transfers sat in limbo. Explanations arrived in neutral language, citing reviews, compliance checks, internal policy. No rejection was declared. Nothing was confirmed. Money simply stopped moving with the certainty trade requires. Most international trade settles through banking channels linked, directly or indirectly, to the U.S. dollar. Even when neither buyer nor seller is American, settlement often passes through that system. This architecture concentrates power in places far removed from ports and factories. When sanctions expanded, banks handling Cuban transactions faced penalties, scrutiny, and the risk of exclusion from the dollar network. That risk changed behavior immediately. Behind the scenes, compliance departments recalculated exposure. Cuban transactions were flagged as high risk. Each payment invited questions that carried potential consequences. Fines, audits, loss of correspondent access. For global banks, the calculation was simple. No single Cuban transaction was worth jeopardizing access to the dominant financial system. Caution became policy. The effect was swift and uneven. Some payments were delayed. Others were refused outright. Accounts were frozen or quietly closed. Explanations varied, but outcomes converged. Settlement became unreliable. Even third-country banks, with no political stake, stepped back. They were not enforcing policy. They were protecting access. This was the turning point. Cuba could still sell goods, but it could not reliably receive payment. It could agree to buy supplies, but it could not guarantee transfer of funds. Contracts existed in theory. In practice, every transaction carried uncertainty. Planning collapsed under that uncertainty. Cause and effect were precise. Financial fear reduced banking cooperation. Reduced cooperation disrupted trade. Disrupted trade starved production. The economy slowed not because demand vanished, but because settlement failed. Goods were available. Buyers existed. What broke was trust in payment. Ask what happens when money cannot move, even if goods can. Every transaction requires a workaround. Barter replaced cash. Intermediaries added layers. Delays multiplied. Costs rose. Efficiency collapsed. Each adjustment kept trade alive while draining value from it. The system did not announce its pressure loudly. It worked through risk assessments and internal rules. No single authority needed to issue commands. The architecture enforced itself. Banks avoided danger. Trade partners hesitated. The outcome was the same as a blockade, achieved without stopping ships. Inside Cuba, the effects were immediate. Imports slowed unpredictably. Fuel deliveries became irregular. Raw materials arrived late, or not at all. Factories ran below capacity, not for lack of orders, but for lack of inputs. Export revenue, when it arrived late, incomplete, or through channels that reduced its value. Every transaction became an exception. Normal commerce turned into negotiation. Time horizons shortened. Planning shifted from months to weeks. The economy lost rhythm. What remained was reaction. Ministries spent energy solving payment problems rather than developing strategy. Survival replaced optimization. The fear that drove the system did not require coordination. It required only asymmetry. The cost of engagement for banks was high. The cost of disengagement was low. That imbalance ensured withdrawal. Once a few major institutions stepped back, others followed. No one wanted to be last to exit. This is how financial power operates when fully embedded. It does not need enforcement teams. It relies on incentives. The system does exactly what it is designed to do. It makes certain transactions too dangerous to touch. Cuba adapted as it always had. Barter deals expanded. Alternative currencies were tested. Informal channels carried what formal ones would not. These measures kept parts of the economy moving, but they could not replace normal settlement. Each workaround carried friction and loss. The blockade was no longer about goods crossing borders. It was about value crossing systems. That distinction mattered. Physical trade could continue at reduced levels. Financial trade could not normalize. The economy slowed under a weight that was invisible to those who measured activity by ships and factories alone. This mechanism was more precise than force. It targeted flow rather than capacity. It allowed production to continue while denying reward. Over time, that denial reshaped behavior. Investment stalled. Maintenance was deferred. Efficiency gave way to improvisation. What made this pressure so effective was its deniability. No single actor appeared responsible. Each bank pointed to policy. Each policy pointed to risk. The result was systemic without being declared. Control operated through absence rather than presence. That be why the time the pattern was clear. Reversal was difficult. The system had internalized avoidance. Even easing rules could not restore trust quickly. Once banks exit a risk category, return is slow. Damage accumulates faster than repair. Cuba's economy entered a new phase. Not cut off entirely, but trapped in uncertainty. Trade existed, but it was fragile. Production continued, but it was starved. The dollar clearing blockade did not destroy capacity. It neutralized it. This was the economic weapon revealed. Not a ban on selling, but a barrier to being paid. Not isolation. The consequences settled slowly into daily life, where systems become reality. Shortages deepened, not suddenly, but unevenly. Some weeks fuel arrived. Others it did not. Shelves emptied without warning, then refilled briefly, then emptied again. Planning became guesswork, because payments failed unpredictably. What could be bought one month became unreachable the next, even when suppliers were willing. Infrastructure decayed under this uncertainty. Maintenance depends on regular inputs and reliable scheduling. When settlement cannot be guaranteed, repairs wait. Equipment sits idle for lack of parts. Power grids strain under deferred upkeep. The economy did not stop functioning. It functioned poorly, expending more effort for less result. Ordinary people paid the price most directly. Rationing tightened. Wages lagged behind need. Choice narrowed. The effects were not abstract. They were felt in kitchens, buses, hospitals, and workplaces. The state absorbed blame because it was visible. The pressure that shaped outcomes remained largely invisible, embedded in systems far beyond public reach. Over time, Cuba reshaped itself around survival. Alternative currencies were introduced and withdrawn. Regional partners were sought with urgency. Informal channels expanded to bridge gaps formal ones could not cross. These adaptations kept the economy alive, but they came at a cost. Efficiency fell. Transparency declined. Long-term planning became almost impossible. None of these alternatives fully replaced access to the dominant system. They were partial, fragile, and expensive. Each workaround added friction. Each intermediary took a share. Each delay reduced value. What remained was endurance, not growth. Stability gave way to persistence. The long-term effect was isolation by design, enforced through finance rather than force. Cuba was not sealed off completely. It was kept in a state of permanent exception. Normal trade was possible only through effort and improvisation. That condition shaped behavior across the economy. Risk avoidance replaced ambition. Survival replaced development. Internationally, the case reshaped how countries viewed sanctions. It demonstrated that control over clearing systems could discipline states without firing a shot. Trade bans could be porous. Financial pressure was not. The lesson was absorbed quietly by governments and banks alike. Power had found a more precise instrument in a dollar-centered world. Neutrality proved fragile. Access could be revoked quietly, and consequences spread quickly. Decisions made in compliance departments affected factories continents away. The flow of money mattered more than the flow of goods. This reality unsettled assumptions about sovereignty in a globalized economy. Cuba's experience is not only about one island. It is about how power now operates through pipes few people see. Financial systems shape outcomes long before political ones respond. When money stops moving, everything else follows. Regardless of ideology or intent, the pressure did not produce collapse. It produced stagnation and adaptation. That distinction matters. Systems designed to punish without spectacle aim to endure. They reshape behavior slowly, encouraging compliance through exhaustion rather than shock. For Cuba, the result was a narrowed horizon. Choices existed, but they were constrained. Independence remained, but it was costly. Every decision carried the weight of blocked access. Every plan assumed friction. The economy learned to live inside a cage whose bars were invisible but firm. This is the modern form of control. Not invasion, but exclusion. Not occupation, but risk management. It works because it appears technical and impartial. It operates through rules rather than threats. And it leaves few fingerprints. The lesson lingers because the architecture remains. As long as trade depends on centralized clearing, financial access will shape sovereignty. States can produce, negotiate, and endure. Without settlement, None of that guarantees progress, that Cuba's harbor still opens each morning. Cranes still rise. Ships still come and go. But the true traffic that decides outcomes moves elsewhere, through systems designed to be unseen. Understanding that shift is essential to understanding modern power. For those who want to see how economics quietly shapes history, this story matters. If this perspective clarified how pressure now works, this is the moment to subscribe and share, so these hidden mechanisms are not overlooked again.